This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 29th, 1987, the home of the Ray brothers, three HIV-positive Florida boys, burns down in what is almost certainly a case of arson. The brothers were 10, 9, and 8 years old at the time. Each of them had hemophilia, which required them to get blood transfusions, and through those transfusions, they had contracted AIDS from HIV-positive blood donors. When their HIV status became known in their community, which is a town just east of Sarasota, Florida, the family was largely shunned. This was a moment when AIDS was largely still known as a quote-unquote gay disease. Enormous fears and misinformation were spreading about the illness and the people who had it. There were threats at the school where the boys went. They were ostracized from their church. And then this incident, an arson at their home, which was later shown to have started in the boys' bedroom. Reports indicate that in that bedroom, there was a poster hanging on the wall that said, "Please hug me. I have AIDS. I can't make you sick." Let's talk about the Ray brothers' arson, the stigma around AIDS, the larger context of this time, and more. And we have a very special guest for this episode, Eric Marcus, founder and host of the Making Gay History podcast, which is an oral history project to bring largely forgotten voices and stories of the LGBTQ community to life. Eric, welcome to the show. It's an honor. I really love your work, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jody. I'm absolutely delighted to talk with you. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, especially as I lived through this period of history and was reporting on these issues for Good Morning America and CBS Morning News at the time.
Yeah, great. And I want to get your reflections of reporting this out at the time. But quickly, I got to say, I feel like your podcast has been such a standard, but does it feel like you've been doing it for 13 seasons? It's been going for a while, if people don't know it.
Yes, we've been producing for 8 years. I cannot believe that much time has passed, but I look in the mirror and I think, you don't look the way you used to. Well, I just had to update my headshot because I thought, you don't want to be one of those people who when they meet you, they say, "Oh my God, you're so much older than your picture."
But it is incredible work and an incredible archive. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Let's go through the story itself of the Ray brothers, and then, yes, that context of how this connects to other stories, how this connects to the larger way that AIDS was seen at that time in 1987. But the Ray brothers themselves, all three have hemophilia, all three get blood transfusions, they contract HIV. What else do we need to know about them or the community that they come from?
We already knew so much at that time. 1987 wasn't exactly the dark ages. One could argue that in 1981, 82, 83, people were still ignorant. 1987, we knew exactly how HIV was transmitted. The problem was that many people couldn't speak, or most people couldn't speak in explicit terms about it because they were fearful of talking about sex in general, because that was the primary mode of infection. There was terrible leadership in terms of the president. President Reagan barely mentioned AIDS until the mid-1980s. So ignorance was allowed to spread. And these boys lived in a place where people, we look at what happened with the COVID pandemic. People are quick to fear what they don't know. So it wasn't just in places like the town where they lived in Sarasota that people were fearful. People were fearful everywhere. And most people also had no understanding of hemophilia. So, and they thought that if you got one drop of, if the kids were playing with other kids and they scraped their knee and they got one drop of blood on their skin, that was the end of them. They were going to die. That wasn't the case. But there was an overall climate of fear. And may I give you just one example of when I was at CBS, how fearful people were. We had Ryan White on, another kid who had hemophiliac, was infected through tainted blood. He was scheduled to be an in-person guest on the show, and I was doing the segment, so I was the one to greet his mom. And he was 13, I believe 13 at the time. He'd been quite ill, but was doing okay. And he came to the studio in New York, and he had to have hair and makeup done before the segment, but the hair and makeup person at CBS News would not would not do his hair and makeup. Yeah.
Wow.
So we had to find somebody else at CBS to do it, which we did, but it required Ryan to climb a long flight of stairs. And I went up the stairs behind him, and he had a lot of trouble breathing. And I was so embarrassed that here at CBS News in New York City in 1988, that someone on the staff was so fearful of putting his makeup on that they refused.
That really speaks to, I mean, the fear and the hysteria around HIV/AIDS in the 1980s. And it doesn't really begin to change until the 1990s. And so in this moment, you have these three kids who have contracted HIV, and their school bans them. They're just like, we're not going to have these kids come to the school. It's too dangerous for the other students. The parents end up going to court to sue for their children's education, because public education is a right in this country. And they win the case. And then the students and their parents boycott the school because they don't want their children going to school with children who have HIV. And that's when the threats start. And this family becomes a target of all of this fear and hysteria when they're already dealing with what at the time is assumed to be like an illness that is going to kill their children and shorten their lives in pretty significant ways.
Yeah.
It's just so tragic, because when you think of like this is not, Magic Johnson or Arthur Ashe, well-known sort of established celebrities that are already beloved. These are children just trying to go to school and manage their disease. And the idea that someone would want to harm these three children is just unconscionable. But yeah, they suffered quite a bit living in their small town.
Yeah, in that moment, you would have expected, I can imagine Joe Biden or Kamala Harris stepping in, going to that town and saying, listen to me, this is the reality of HIV, picking up the kids, hugging them, as Princess Di did in England with infants. But we didn't have that kind of leadership here, so it led to that kind of discrimination and hate and ignorance. Humans, we are really problematic. I often think we need a software upgrade.
But can you help us tease apart the ways in which we're problematic, or maybe the people in this community were problematic? Because, you talk about the sort of the ignorance and the fear and the bigotry all playing in. But, these are 8, 9, 10-year-old kids. I don't think when they say we're HIV positive, I don't think people are saying, oh, you've been having gay sex, right? There's the homophobia isn't right there. So what is exactly the fear and the lack of knowledge? Is it about how HIV is transmitted, or is there just a sort of like ambient homophobia that somehow you see plays into this story in some way?
Sure. There's contagion fear, as there was during the COVID pandemic. There's a determined ignorance. And in this case, a difficulty in speaking explicitly about the disease. What people talked in euphemisms in those days, bodily fluids. It was thought and rumored at one point that tears and saliva could be a vector for the virus. Not true. It was never the case. It wasn't airborne. But if you don't have leadership, as we saw during the COVID pandemic as well, it's very easy for people to lose their minds.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what they did. There was nothing rational about the response to these boys. They were just kids, as you said, who were ill. I mean, they were ill with hemophilia to start with.
Right.
So it's willful ignorance. It's public hysteria. It's like the Salem witch trials. Just burn them at the stake. Yeah. And they literally set fire to the house the kids lived in.
But when AIDS first appeared, it was sort of branded as this quote-unquote gay disease. And I want to get your thoughts on sort of how persistent and how long that is persistent and whether it plays into this story. But then, of course, it can get transmitted through blood transfusions. Is there a sort of wide understanding in this moment, 1987, of that being a relatively common way in which this can get transmitted?
You use the word understanding. And that suggests that there was a concerted effort to educate people. There was a concerted effort in the gay community, the gay male white community in particular, that organized at that time. 1987 was when ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was founded. There was already AIDS spreading in the intravenous drug user community, and plenty of people of color were getting ill and dying, including black women and children. But that was a community that was already on the margins and ostracized. And so here you have a marginalized community of drug-dependent people, as well as gay men who were still very much on the margins at that time. And people didn't care. And a lot of people thought that drug addicts deserved to die. They did it to themselves. Gay men deserved to die. It was, I remember vividly at the time, the right-wing anti-gay folks who just branded this as a gay disease because they were perfectly happy for gay people, gay men, to die. We were getting what we deserved. And the tragedy there, of course, it was all these young men who we didn't know at the time that we were infecting each other in the 1970s. This disease had a long incubation period. So you have a disease that was branded as a disease only of people who are already diseased. It was a terrible, terrible, and terrifying time. For those of us who were gay and young and had been sexually active, we didn't know yet. There was no test until 1985. We didn't know if we were going to live or die.
And I think, not to push the story too far forward, Jody, but in thinking about the role of homophobia and all of this, it is telling that the people who become the face of education for sort of like straight white people in the United States on what AIDS is are people like Ryan White, who contracts it, as we've talked about, through a blood transfusion, who's a child. Mary Fisher, who speaks at the Republican National Convention in 1992, a woman who contracted it through heterosexual sex with her husband and transmitted it to her children through childbirth. That the kind of face of AIDS, when it becomes more humanized and gets more policy attention, is not gay men, but are these people who are seen as worthy of sympathy and attention.
Because they're innocent. They're innocent.
Or they're celebrities like Magic Johnson and Arthur Ashe.
But I remember even in 92, I mean, this was must be one of my earlier memories, but in 92, I remember Magic Johnson was set to play in the All-Star game, and people were really concerned. What happens if he gets a cut? What happens if I'm rub up against him and my sweat touches his sweat? I mean, those fears were still...
Oh, yeah. And when Greg Louganis came out about having HIV/AIDS, and I co-wrote his autobiography with him, and the book was released in 95. And when it became clear he had hit his head on the diving board during the Olympic trials in Seoul, Korea, and fell in the pool, oh, my God, there's blood in the water. I think... You're going to get infected by somebody who has fallen into the water after hitting his head, plus he didn't bleed in the pool because it was cold and he didn't start bleeding until he was out of the pool. Maybe his doctor was at risk because he was not using gloves when he sewed up Greg's head. But the hysteria in 1995, you cannot believe. And for people living today, it's very hard to imagine, unless you think about the hysteria around COVID. There were legitimate reasons to be hysterical about COVID because it was an airborne disease.
Because it could spread through all kinds
through the air.
Hey there, it's Jody. I want to take a moment to tell you about a new podcast that I really think you would like. From the Scopes monkey trial to O.J. Simpson, trials have always made us reflect on the world we live in. History on Trial explores fascinating trials from American history. Join host Mira Hayward as she reveals the true story behind the headlines and discover how the legal battles of the past have shaped our present. Listen and subscribe to History on Trial wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Okay, the Ray brothers, back to them and the moment their house gets burned. The father is quoted here. I mean, they had been, I would say, maybe not activists, but they had been sort of active, and certainly just at a local level, we're just fighting for, we want to go back to school, we want to be treated fairly, etc. When this incident goes down, when their house gets burned down, the father is just quoted as saying, like, we get the message. It's very clear we're not wanted here. They do move to another town where, by all accounts, they move to Sarasota, where, by all accounts, life is a little easier. There's a bit of more of an embrace. But I'm just struck by there's an opposition group in their new school that is called Citizens Against AIDS. And I just am so struck by the name of that group because
it's like all citizens are against AIDS,
right? But I mean, Greg, not to be too sort of like close reading, do too close of a reading of that name, but I mean, it seems to capture so much of like the fear and ignorance and just like rage and like I'm just.
It's like Moms for Liberty. Right. It's like you look at those names and it's just
White
a big
Citizens
lie.
Council.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. They were unfortunately the magnet of and targets for all kinds of fear and hatred. And I think it was all bundled up in hatred of gay people, of drug-dependent people, and they had this very rare illness besides. It's tragic. But we see also that Bill Clinton stepped in, and this is after Reagan was out of office, and he showed leadership. And that, I think, was the biggest failure, was that there wasn't leadership at the highest level to protect this one family. They are emblematic of the kind of craziness that was going on at the time. I remember when at hospitals where people who were in isolation rooms and food was just left outside their door because health workers were terrified. And these are people who know better.
Yeah. I think to the innocence point that you made earlier, there is a way that communities rally around the Rays after this happened because there is such kind of like these poor kids are sick and their home is burned down and money flows into fundraising. Lawmakers pass in 1988 the Ricky Ray Relief Fund Act, which is to give funds for studying hemophilia and to help people who contract HIV through blood transfusions. So there is a kind of rallying effect that happens because of just the obscene cruelty of what happens to this family. But again, like it is very much contingent on that innocence that you're talking about. I was just about
to say, it's you can get $100,000 if this was an accident, if you got tainted blood. Like that's how they phrased it.
Yeah, and things did shift. And I don't think most people wanted to burn down the house of these kids. Most people were simply fearful, rationally fearful. And then you had a small core group of people who were nuts, who were just out of their minds, crazy. And if they are the people who are trying to ban books now and are terrified of gender-affirming surgery for adults. I mean, all the rest. These people have always been among us, and the key is to stand up to them. These are the bullies that we see today. They are the people who have inherited the mantle of the citizens against AIDS. I just love it. Like, who isn't against AIDS?
I know.
I also just want to, on the leadership front, you talked, I think, about how Bill Clinton met with Ricky Ray. He later would present him with a posthumous award for his AIDS activism. He also met with Pedro Zamora, who came to public attention on the first season of MTV's Real World as a gay man and an AIDS activist who contracted AIDS and would die fairly early on in the Clinton administration. So it matters. Like that leadership did matter and sort of starting to bring down some of the barriers to getting treatment, to demystifying the disease, and to destigmatizing the disease.
Of course. And we have to remember that the world's understanding, or at least here in the U.S., the understanding of homosexuality, gay people, the lives that we lived, it was such a different world. My first book was published in 1988 called The Male Couple's Guide to Living Together. Now, you'd think that's a rather innocuous book. I got a lot of media attention for it, and I was very nervous about the kinds of questions I might get from journalists. And I remember being on CNN Newsnight Update, which was a call-in show overnight. And I was on split screen with the host, and even though we were in the studio together. And I watched the tape later, and he was chewing on his pencil the whole time and never got past the questions of, when did you know? How did your parents react? I got those. Who plays the husband? Who plays the wife? I got those questions all the time. We have a much better understanding today. And homosexuality has been so normalized. But it was not that case in the 1980s. It's a couple of generations ago. It was so different. So you combine that with a disease that's sexually transmitted, and then through IV drug use and blood transfusions, it brings up all kinds of craziness and ignorance that needs to be dispelled. But we had a lot of people who were promoting ignorance actively, and leadership that had chosen to ignore what was happening.
Not for nothing, this story also had a big impact on conversations around, and policy around hemophilia and the blood supply and all these other things as well, which is a big part of this story as well.
The people who supplied blood were actively lobbying not to be regulated.
Right.
Not to have to test for HIV because it affected their bottom line. They'd have to throw out lots of blood samples. Oh my God! It's just I need to take a sedative after our conversation today. It takes me back in time, and I was there, and it was a terrible, terrible time to live through. We did a season of the podcast called Coming of Age during the 1980s, which is all about the AIDS crisis, and I had to revisit the time and interview people, and it was traumatic. Absolutely traumatic. I was in my 20s. It was just a terrible time.
I mean, that point is worth emphasizing as we wrap up here, that this is very recent history. I mean, Randy Ray died just last year at the age of only 43, and his brother Robert died 22 in 2000, and I think NIki hinted at this, but Ricky Ray died in 92 at age 15. But these are guys
not
my age.
ago.
These are
not. This is not.
It was heartbreaking to read that. I didn't know that until I read the notes that they died so young. But often people who have hemophilia do, and had HIV. Yeah.
And I think that it was so recent, and yet the reason why this story is so important to retell, I teach a class on the history of the 90s, and my students who are 18, 19, 20 years old, this is completely mystifying to them. They have no context for the level of homophobia, for the level of fear, for how stigmatized gay men were and people who contracted HIV/AIDS were. And so in some ways, that's an amazing sign of progress. On the other hand, it's important to tell these stories because it wasn't that long ago. And the social dynamics that can create a moment like this still exist in many ways. And so it's a wild thing.
I remember was it 92, 93 when Philadelphia came out with Tom
93
Hanks or 93. Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, but
Yes.
just the how much I think ideas have changed is sort of astounding when you think about the fact that it's not that long ago. But when you're living through it, it feels like eternity trying to get these ideas to feel progressive.
Yeah.
Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation, or illuminating conversation. I got to say, as we wrap up, the one thing I want to, it's so silly, but these boys' names are Ricky Ray, Robert Ray, and Randy Ray. And Kellie, as a parent of multiple children, would you ever name your kids that close together? I just feel like you would just spend all your time confusing them.
Oh my gosh, I struggle. I struggle now because my daughter's nicknames are JoJo and Coco, and I mess up their nicknames. I'm like, JoJo, Coco, come here.
I'm sure there was some significance to these names, but I'm just like the parents, you just really played yourself by naming the kid this close. But
I know, I can imagine them yelling their names and missing them all up. Yeah.
But really an incredible story, and we're so grateful to have you, Eric, on to help guide us through it. So want to shout out any recent episodes of Making Gay History that you're proud of? I know you do a lot of special series as well, and those.
Yes, most of our episodes are feature individual people who I had the privilege of interviewing more than 35 years ago for an oral history book about what was then called the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Movement. The two series I'm really proud of, aside from the Stonewall series that we did, is Coming of Age during the AIDS crisis, which I just mentioned a short while ago, and also Coming of Age during the 1970s, the decade prior. So you get a real sense of what life was like then, at least for this one gay man, me, and set in the context of the times and the fight for equal rights.
Well, Making Gay History is out there for all of you to dive into if you're not already listening. But Eric Marcus, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me on. A delight.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Ricky, Robert, and Randy Ray are infected with the AIDS virus. You could never tell it by looking at them, but all three of the Ray boys are hemophiliacs and contracted the disease through the plasma used to clot their blood. But today, the children still can't understand why people are so scared, why their friends don't come over to play anymore, or their neighbors don't hug them, why they can't go to church or school, or even why their longtime barber in Zolfo Springs told them she couldn't cut their hair.
We ain't even sick. We're just regular kids. Just the antibody. You can't catch it.
Radiotopia. From